Call the Senate Judiciary Committee back to order.
Call the House Senate or the House Committee back to order. The House Senate Committee back to order.
Good afternoon, co-chairs Williamson and Przanski, members of the committee, and members of this incredible audience. For the record, I'm Colette Peters, the director of the Oregon Department of Corrections, and I am thrilled to be here today to close this week's Justice Reinvestment Summit. What an amazing and inspiring 3 days. Harold, you're going to have to remind me of the quote where you're scared to death to follow someone, because I'm scared to death to follow Captain Toby Toole and Officer Reischke. Was that not amazing? So what's the quote? Thank you. Yes, thank you, Harold. So I'd like to start by thanking Governor Kate Brown for kicking off the summit and making such powerful comments. I am just forever grateful for the governor's continued support and leadership in our arena. And before I get to the heart of the matter, I must thank a few of you who are in the audience today. First, thank you to our legislative body. Some of you have traveled to Norway to explore and learn about the system. Some of you came as skeptics, but you all came home as believers. So thank you for today, the largest legislative hearing in the history of legislative hearings. That's pretty historic, right? So as we look out at this crowd, it's amazing to say that we're actually hosting a joint legislative committee in front of nearly 1,300 people. But your continued advocacy for our training, the health and well-being of our team members, and for those in our care and custody is just beyond appreciated. So thank you so much. Our Norwegian delegation, now that you all have food in your mouth, will you please stand to be recognized? Thank you so much to this delegation who traveled the furthest to be with us this week. Our relationship began as a collegial exchange of information and has now squarely landed with us all as dear, dear friends. And as their gift revealed, that is a picture of the sunrise. And so it's very reflective that this is just the beginning of our relationship. I want to thank you for so graciously and literally opening your homes to us and showing us a way of life, your correctional system. And as you can see, and as you talked about, Kim, you've just made such a big impact on us in such a little amount of time. And I look forward to continuing our partnership and really looking forward to this next week where now you get to see our world and begin that exchange of information. So again, thank you so much. We have a very, very special guest with us today. And thanks to Dr. Williams' magic, she actually surprised us by bringing Harold to Oregon this go-around. You all met Harold this morning. Now, what you didn't learn from Harold is that in Norway, Harold is like Cher, Prince, or Madonna. We need only use his first name. He is not a rock star, however, even though he's looked like one in his country. He is recognized in his country in the same way as a crime survivor. He only talked briefly about his experience, but he was a victim left for dead during the terrorist bombing of the public safety headquarters that preceded that hellacious terrorist murdering of all those children on July 22nd, 2011, on the island of Utoya. He survived. His entire body has been reconstructed, and he tells us that his previous wives say he's actually now better looking than before the event. Thank you to those surgeons. But he still has major health issues to deal with. And for those of you that know me personally know that I believe in guardian angels and small miracles, and his life is a miracle. So is something else. While I could spend my entire time talking about what Harold has taught me, there was another miracle, and he talked about it a little bit today. As you know, he is one of the founders of Norway's new correctional system and theories regarding normalcy and humanity. And yet he didn't lose his faith in the system he created after becoming that crime victim. Not only did he not lose his faith, he shares his story, like he did with you today, to advocate for a system of normalcy and humanity, knowing it makes for better public safety, knowing it makes for better neighbors. So Harold, with that, I have a gift from us to you with a quote from you on the back, which we've heard multiple times today: be proud, but not satisfied. Thank you. It's a mug that's actually inscribed by the women at Coffee Creek, and they're very proud of the artwork on the back, Harold, as are we. Next, I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to Scott Moyer and Andrea Fionda. If you could please stand. Scott and Andrea are now passionate advocates of normalization and humanization from the Jacob and Valerie Langeloff Foundation, who, as you know, funded our last exploration, our officer exchange, the presence of so many of you with us here today and next week for our statewide training. Without you, none of this week would have been possible. Thank you for your generosity and true belief that criminal justice can be different here in Oregon and the United States. Your funding has clearly sparked a movement at the Oregon Department of Corrections, and now all of Oregon is paying attention, and that means that there are going to be great things to come for many years to come. So thank you for your support. Dr. Bree Williams, Michelle Cassidy, and Cyrus from the Criminal Justice Health and Health Program at the University of California, San Francisco. That's always a mouthful. You have supported my team and this project every step of the way with just a fire and a passion that can hardly even be described. I will be forever grateful. And you took Oregon's connectedness to criminal justice and health just to this whole new level. And I truly believe this is just the beginning. So thank you for your partnership. Don Spector. Don Spector also needs our collective thank you. You met Don this morning. I want to thank him and really call him out for his vision and willingness to fund and educate us on best practices. He was being quite humble when he talked about how he decided to just alter his course a bit. Rather than only suing corrections organizations to improve the conditions of confinement, which was effective to a great degree across this country, he now is funding our states and other states' education and exploration so that he can teach us how to create more normal, more human systems. Thank you, Don. I also need to give a public thank you to every single Oregon Department of Corrections team member who volunteered to explore Norway, both at Norway and at home. I have a whole host of DOC employees in the audience. Will you please all stand to be recognized? All of you. I am so proud of this team. It's just so courageous of all of you to take this leap of faith and push the boundaries of a system you already believed in, a system that is already marked as one of the best in the country. And yet you're here today. Some of you went to Norway to roll up your sleeves and just push that barrier even further. I spoke in my opening remarks. I have to again say a very special thank you to Captain Toby Tooley and Officer Brian Reischke. Little did you know that when you volunteered to go to Norway and explore a new system, that you'd actually be asked to speak in front of almost 1,400 people. and you nailed it. So thank you and congratulations. You've made me very proud. Last but not least, I need to call out the Criminal Justice Commission for just a moment. No one does grant funding, big data, or justice reinvestment summits like you do. The portal that you have created has allowed us in public safety to have just real-time access to data trends that impact our organizations and our communities immediately. It was the first and maybe still the only one in the nation. All of your efforts created this amazing public safety summit that is unique and exceptional, and Director Mike Schmidt, your leadership is to be commended. Thank you. As has been mentioned multiple times over the last couple days, this Justice Reinvestment Summit is Oregon's largest gathering of public safety stakeholders. And it was the largest the first time we met. And there were just 512 of us there. So to have over 1,300 people sign up and join us this year shows some incredible growth and commitment to justice reinvestment. So we've come a long way. Just 7 years ago, back in 2012, we were looking at a very different future and startling prison population forecast. At that time, the Oregon Commission on Public Safety found that we would need an additional 2,300 beds by 2021. 2,300 beds. Now, 2021 seemed a long ways away back in 2012. We can peek around the corner and see 2021. So that would have been our present state. Some of the things that population growth would have meant for Oregon and meant for the Department of Corrections is the minimum facility at the Oregon State Penitentiary would be open and full with women. Our prison in Madras, Deer Ridge, would be full, both the minimum and the medium. We would have broken ground, built, and opened Oregon's 15th facility in Junction City. We would be funding hundreds of additional staff working across the state, from correctional officers, nurses, food services coordinators, office staff, and counselors. And number 5, in order to make all of that happen, the state would have needed to invest an additional $600 million to accommodate that growth in our incarcerated population. So I'll let that sink in for a moment. I'm currently requesting $2 billion for the next biennial budget. We would have been needing an additional $600 million to accomplish those things. So, with Norway in the room, thankfully, that is not our reality. Stakeholders across the entire public safety community were concerned about the growing cost of corrections and how our growth would negatively impact many of your local public safety programs. So in 2013, we passed House Bill 3194, landmark legislation that reduced our population, where we should only see a growth of about 500 individuals over the next 10 years. The bill also did tremendous things. It invested in savings and proven interventions that will prevent crime, enhance community corrections, enhance evidence-based law enforcement, and strengthen victim services while either holding or reducing recidivism. Now, there are many of you in this room that think 3194 went too far. There are many in this room who think we didn't go far enough. But the thing that I am most proud of, and many of you have heard me say, is that we as a criminal justice system and as a state came together. We compromised in that piece of legislation. We overcame obstacles, we overcame differences, and we literally redefined our path going forward. And we did that together. It is my sincere hope that Oregon continues to be a model for the nation, that continues that bipartisan work to tackle our collective issues and to protect the public. I would love for Dr. Williams' dream to come true, where Oregon does become the new Norway here in the United States. So what does that mean? What does come next? This year, this month, on February 5th, I had the privilege of celebrating my 7th anniversary as the director of the Oregon Department of Corrections. And thank you. and it has been an honor. I am so fortunate to lead an agency filled with people that believe in change and reformation and believe that those things are possible. So many of you hear me talk about those amazing human beings. I often testify in front of the legislature about these amazing human beings, and you got to meet them today and talk to them and hear their heart and hear their story. And over the past several years, we've made significant progress in reducing the number of people in special housing, as we talked about earlier, in reducing their length of stay. We are providing programming on these units now. We're enhancing and increasing out-of-cell times and reducing those returns to special housing. We're being creative in how we're working with these individuals in ways that we wouldn't even have dreamed of 5 years ago. And we are at historic lows for the number of men and women we house in these units and their length of stay, to the degree that we just closed a special housing unit at Snake River Correctional Institution and converted it to honor housing. That's historic. Thank you. Captain Tooley mentioned this briefly. Thanks to the legislature, we have built and staffed and are now operating an adequate behavioral health unit treatment space at the Oregon State Penitentiary. Now we have treatment space that looks more normal, like treatment space you and I would visit if we were seeking help in our community. Now you saw the action item, the action log that Dr. Williams put up on the screen. We have a long list of ideas and proposals that are being reviewed and assessed by our executive and leadership teams. It's a list we began, legislators, when we were in Norway together, and we've just grown that list. So we're working through that list to really determine when and where we want to implement. I am a true believer in a large organization such as ours that we actually need to move slow in order to move fast. It's so important that we're considerate in how we do this, but we also want to be bold in our action. So I want my team and our stakeholders bought in. You saw officers who are clearly bought in. We want them to bring everyone along in this adventure. You've heard a lot about the resource team model that Norway introduced us to. This is certainly something that we want to bring to the Department of Corrections, and we are so grateful that the Norwegian delegation is going to spend the next week or so traveling our state and teaching officers from across our organization on this model. We think that's going to be incredibly powerful. We're also planning to look at our base. We want to do a thorough review of all of our rules and policies. And while that might sound boring to you all, in a paramilitary organization, that's how we make change. So we're reviewing those policies and procedures and rules and asking each time we look at them, why are we operating this way? Could we operate in a way that's more normal, more human, more constructive, with better outcomes? So I'm going to say it publicly. I don't like the word inmate. It negatively labels people, and it very easily allows us to have this us against them dynamic. So not only would I like us to investigate and consider removing the word inmate from statute, I also want to explore Superintendent Brandon Kelly's idea of removing the name inmate from their clothing. They're already in denim, they're already in a uniform, we already know that they're in our care and custody. Do we really need to brand them with a name that brings stigma to them? So, thank you. And thank you, Superintendent. Staff wellness. I'd like to talk about one aspect of the Norwegian system that was talked about briefly, but it absolutely stunned me as well as saddened me back home. Their officers are fit, trim, they're mentally healthy, they're physically healthy, they enjoy coming to work, and we don't have that in Oregon. You saw the statistics. You're now eating lunch, so I won't depress you again. But those statistics are depressing, and we should be outraged. We should be screaming in the streets. The Norway staff have figured out how to be engaged and remain healthy. They're encouraged to take time off. Mandatory overtime is not an issue. And how wonderful is that you've created a system that actually values your employees and keeps them healthy along the way. And I believe our country is ready for this conversation, ready for this notion around normalcy and humanity. I think a great example just came out of DC in the midst of all the craziness that we're hearing about coming out of Washington, DC. They just passed historic public safety and prison reform in a bipartisan manner with the First Step Act and rolling the Second Chance Act inside of that. If that can happen in DC, Oregon can do amazing things. And I think this country has already laid the groundwork for some of these conversations. And I'd like to share a couple examples of states who began this conversation as well. Colorado. Colorado has been a national leader in segregation reform. I think that it was catapulted by an incredibly tragic event when my friend and colleague, the director of the Department of Colorado, was assassinated at his home. Tom Clements lost his life in 2013 at the hands of a former adult in custody who had been released directly to the community after spending 7 years in solitary confinement. 7 years. Extensive research has shown, we talked about it a little bit today, that long-term isolation aggravates and even manufactures mental illness. And when so many adults in custody will ultimately, as we've heard how many times today, be released back to our communities, 95% of them are going to be our neighbors again. We can't only rely on this approach of segregation if we want to make our prisons and our communities safer. We can look to Iowa on how they're managing the female adults in their custody. 8 years ago, when that state moved to replace its very outdated women's prison, they were absolutely unequivocal about what the new institution was going to look like. They wanted a prison that wasn't stereotypical. They wanted a space designed for women, not men. They insisted on natural light and an atmosphere that actually would allow the women to feel safe so they could work on the underlying issues that had brought them to prison in the first place. And it looked like a college campus when they were done. And it worked. The data points have been amazing. A 66% decline in critical incidents in that prison after opening that new facility. And they didn't stop at prison design. They trained and encouraged their correctional officers to do the Norway thing, to coach during minor violations, rather than writing them up, which ultimately ended up in a segregation placement. And that is just a small step, but it's part of a growing movement. North Dakota was one of the first states to take the brave leap and visit Norway, and they came back and made significant changes as well. One of the first was actually to allow minimum security adults in custody to wear street clothes as they approach their release date. Can you imagine that? Street clothes in our prisons. That may seem small, but think about any previous hospital stay that you've had, and the first thing you want to do when you leave is put on your own pajamas, put on your own clothes. That transition is the same for those in our care and custody, probably even more powerful for those in our care and custody, let alone being perceived as normal while in custody, in even a tiny way by my team, by those visiting them. Pretty substantial. So now I'll bring it home to Oregon. You've seen witness and testimony today. Oregon is ready too. Enhancing an already healthy culture is a huge lift, especially when talking about crime and punishment. If you have ever read the comments for the online articles about the Department of Corrections, my comm staff tells me never to read them. But it doesn't matter if it's about something horrible that's happened inside my agency or if it's about my puppy program. Somebody in Oregon has something negative to say. And we want to change that. And we're not starting at ground zero. We have wonderful, innovative, humane, and normal programs that are happening across the state in every part of our public safety system. I would like to call out our very own Douglas County Community Corrections. On their own, Douglas County Community Corrections team made it a part of their mission to help the local homeless community. They make trips to homeless camps and distribute hygiene supplies to the men and women who live there. This work isn't required. It was actually an idea brought forward by frontline POs to their supervisor. And you don't even need to ask yourself if this would make an impact. That seems normal to me. That seems human. I want to call out the Oregon State Police, who are also turning the dial on humanization. I'd like to call out OSP Superintendent Travis Hampton, who advanced further an already great organization. His team created, planned, and implemented the Oregon Car Care Program, is what they're calling it. He is a great leader and a dear friend of mine who grew up in that organization, spent his entire career at the Oregon State Police, and he tells us that it drove him absolutely crazy his entire career that when he pulled someone over for a broken taillight, he had to issue them a ticket, knowing full well that they probably didn't have the money to fix the taillight or they would have done so already. So instead, what happened when they didn't fix the taillight and they got pulled over again, then they enter this perilous cycle for people with low or modest income, receiving a ticket, being unable to pay, failing to appear, facing additional fines, and so on and so on. You all know the drill. So he chose instead to partner with local private entities to receive, rather than a ticket, a voucher for taillights at a reduced price. The goals of the program were simple and grand in the same breath: improve public perception of law enforcement, assist the communities we serve, and show that public safety, not issuing tickets, is our number one priority. So far, over 26,000 vouchers have been handed out, and now I get to do a shout out to the Oregon State Sheriff's Association and the Oregon Association of Chiefs of Police, who reached out to be part of the program and have joined these efforts as well. That's normalization, that's humanization. Here in Salem, I have a great story that Chief Jerry Moore of the Salem PD shared while at one of the Governor's Reentry Council meetings. He was so proud of this one officer that had to pull someone over because the individual was driving erratically. Of course, he ran this individual prior to making contact at the door and learned that he was on post-prison supervision. The man, as we all are, right, so nervous when the officer approached. But the officer was kind and knew to ask insightful questions, quickly learning that he had just been released from one of my prisons the day before. He hadn't driven in years, wasn't actually sure how to get where he was going, and on and on. He treated him with such kindness. There was no citation, no ticket, and in fact, there was an offer to buy him a cup of coffee. That's normalization, that's humanization, and that's an example of hundreds that happen every day in this state that we don't even know about. Oregon DOC has been a national leader even before our partnership with Norway. However, we have never been satisfied at DOC, and we've always wanted to constantly thrive for better outcomes. So I am just thrilled at the grassroots efforts and discussions that are happening at all levels of my organization. And that's what we hoped for. When we were in Norway, that was our hope. Could we actually bring individuals over to witness this firsthand? And we did. And you've heard from them, and you see their passion, and you see what they've brought to the organization. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing. When we got back from Norway, one of the first things we did was to update our correctional officer position descriptions. Now, before you think that sounds like Snoozeville, like those policies and procedures I talked about, let me explain what we found when we translated the Norwegian's position description and recruitment flyer. Now, this is going to be a little tongue-in-cheek, so don't quote me. But ours said something to the fact of, we're looking for correctional officers who will come to work every day, working in a secure environment, where they will be placed in risky environments where they could be harmed and exposed to dangerous situations. And they're responsible for the safety and security of prisons and reformation and change. The translated Norwegian document said something to the effect of, we are looking for change agents who come to work every day wanting to change the lives of those in our care and custody, where you will work in a secure environment where safety and security is your primary responsibility. Two very different pieces of paper. And they recruit, I think, different people. Coffee Creek is another example. I'm going to give another shout out to Superintendent Paula Myers at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, who is also on the Norway program, and they are now providing to the women in our care more feminine hygiene products at no cost. The superintendent is in the audience, and I'd like to give her a round of applause. And we were also pleasantly surprised with the overwhelming support from the community when we made this change, from the media, from elected officials. That community support is so important, and that's normalization, that's humanization. Children of incarcerated parents. Our prison on the coast at Shutter Creek has partnered with Coos County Library Services District with the goal to encourage reading with children of incarcerated parents. They received this incredible grant that now comes in and video and audio records the men at that facility reading to their children. Then that video and audio recording is folded in a box with that book and sent to their child as a keepsake. To further humanize the project, the men are actually allowed to change out of their denim uniforms and into civilian clothes for the video recording. Quite a new set of connections for these children, and these are examples of just small steps that we've made to create better neighbors, not just better adults in custody. These steps that are normal, steps that are human, and steps that will equal better public safety. I'd like to share a little personal story of mine. When Governor Kulongoski asked me to be the director of the Oregon Youth Authority, it was, of course, thrilling and daunting all at the same time, but even more intimidating because Governor Kulongoski was instrumental in the creation of the Oregon Youth Authority with the passage of Senate Bill 1, and many people actually refer to him as the father of OYA. And so I certainly didn't want to disappoint him. I asked him what he wanted me to do and what vision did he have. And he paused thoughtfully and said, "Just try something new. Envision a new way of doing business. Pilot things, see if they work. We've been doing the same things and getting the same results for decades. Just try something new." So at that moment, as this new young director, I knew I had the permission to lead the agency in a new direction for the benefit of the kids in our care. And I think that is the spirit and vision that is with us here today. So what's next? I think we can, and that we should, continue to endeavor for greatness. Our new motto, as you've heard multiple times today, thanks to Harold, is a quote from him after learning a little bit about our system. Everyone in America and even in Norway, they admitted they had perceptions about our system. Orange is the New Black, Shawshank Redemption, right? All the things they see on TV. And so Harold was quite impressed when he learned about the humanization and normalization inside our massive systems. But he said to us very thoughtfully, "Be proud, but not satisfied." So that's our focus. The focus and our base must always be safety and security and public safety. And then if it is, then we can stretch ourselves. So today, at the end of this week, let's ask ourselves, what if? What if Oregon could be the next Norway in the United States and set the best practices for this nation? What if children of incarcerated parents had the needed resources, support, and guidance the entire time their parents were incarcerated? What if visiting wasn't scary and stigmatized? What if family connections could be made stronger during an incarceration? And what if children could be reunited with their parents upon release and they had no more additional risk of incarceration than my own girls? What if we further reduced the prison population and I was able to keep the same number of staff? Seriously, can you imagine that? Most of our adults in custody could get treatment for their addictions, cognitive therapy for criminal behavior, and imagine that mentoring. We could continue to really role model that social behavior in a way that Norway does with a 1-to-1 staffing ratio, which I know I will never have, but I believe we can do better. What if we had intensive community involvement at each of our 14 institutions? Norway talked about the import model. What if everyone who released from the Oregon Department of Corrections had a mentor as they re-entered into our communities? Can you imagine how our outcomes might be different with that level of community support? What if Oregon had all of the tools they needed to make evidence-based decisions prior to charging and sentencing? Several of you in this room has visited Norway and saw this all firsthand. You are our champions of this reform. This year, our team of corrections professionals had the same experience. I want to share a story. After day 2, I was approached by 2 of our more senior officers who are here with us today. They shared with me that they came to Norway pretty skeptical, but by day 2, they approached me and said, "Boss, promise me that when we go back, we actually get to make change." Because I was so proud of how we did business before I left Oregon. And now I can't come back and morally do the job the way we were doing it. Pretty profound, pretty powerful. So internally, we are asking every day, what's normal? What's human? And we remind ourselves of this at every level in our organization. So in many ways, we've moved the dial as an agency, as a community, and now in the last 3 days as a state. There is still so much to learn and to debate, so I wish we could keep this committee meeting going for another 3 weeks together, but apparently they have other business to do. And so since we cannot, if you leave with anything, please take what you've learned throughout this summit and continue conversations back at the office, back in your field, and continue to do the great work of Oregon. Be thoughtful, be willing to consider new ideas, and be bold in your actions and your thinking. We, as a public safety community, have now been given permission to be bold. Thank you for allowing me to speak with you today about topics I am clearly passionate about and a team I am clearly passionate about. And with that, co-chairs and members of the committee, that ends my testimony today, and I am very happy to take any and all questions. Thank you.
So at this point, we're going to open up for a few questions. I know we're coming up on our time to adjourn, but members, if you have a question to pose to Colette Peters, feel free to do so. And I am looking at who would like to go first. Senator Thatcher.
I think it was a contest of who wanted to go first. Colette, you do great work, and I appreciate the visits that we have in my office about things that are changing. But I want to hear about how you are engaging and encouraging the frontline officers, the staff, and people who have to work with inmates in creating the positive change.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, Senator Thatcher. It's going to be a long process. Culture change, it needs to be thoughtful and strategic. We started with our executive team. We moved next down to the leadership team to really educate them and inspire them around these topics and this conversation. And then the correctional officers exchange, I think, is really going to be profound. I can't move a culture. It's our captains, it's our lieutenants, it's our frontline officers that move the culture. And so getting them bought in, getting them to understand why it's important to them, that it's going to make a better work environment for them and a better public safety outcome for all of Oregon. So I think we're going to see an exponential increase in reform following this next week with these Norway folks and our team traveling across the state, sharing this message, and having frontline Norwegians share with our frontline staff what this is all about. Thank you.
Senator Lithicum.
Thank you. They said lean into the mic. Thank you, Colette. I'm interested a little bit in just some numbers. We heard a fascinating scenario with regard to the island. It was around 125 adults in custody, about 70 employees or so. I'm wondering that 70 employees would be split across 3 shifts of 8 hours or something. That's 25 employees for 125 adults in custody. What kind of staffing ratios does Oregon have compared to that? And I may not have those numbers correct, If you need to call up help front from the Norwegian, feel free.
Right.
But I'm wondering about staff to prisoner relationships and populations. And certainly it's a different environment that has been set up because, as we heard, the prisoners are helping run the island. And those who are incarcerated have a responsibility and a role that we probably don't see a lot of in Oregon. Can you address those issues?
Certainly, Mr. Co-Chair, Senator Linthicum, fascinating question. And when I'm asked about this, this is where I say, as much as we want to strive to be Norway, we'll never be Norway. They do have a 1-to-1 staffing ratio. I can't imagine in my lifetime finding funds in Oregon to make that happen. But could we get closer? So we have 15,000 adults in custody and 4,700 staff. That's nowhere close to a 1-to-1 staffing ratio. You're absolutely correct in your thinking around 3 shifts and needing to spread those employees out across those shifts. But their 1-to-1 staffing ratio really affords an entirely different interaction between the adults in their custody. Every single one of their adults in custody actually is assigned a personal contact officer who is personally responsible for that individual's success. They're required to check in with them every day to see how they're doing in their treatment, their programming, and their preparation for release back into the community. It would be a substantial leap with our staffing patterns to be able to do that. When you think about that kind of a staffing pattern, many of you have been at the Oregon State Penitentiary. Imagine E-Block, where we have nearly 600 adults in custody and 2 officers on that unit. So that interaction is a little different with that sort of a staffing ratio. But could we get closer? As I said in my closing remarks, we have 15,000. Even if we brought that number down substantially and kept 4,700 staff, imagine the strides we could make.
Senator Manning?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really don't have a question, but I do have a comment. And first, I'd like to thank the Norwegian delegation for coming, sharing your story. I think it's very powerful. We have a long ways to go in terms of our incarceration rates, how we treat people, but I think that we're off on the right path to get it there. Under your leadership, I really appreciate this. What I do want to make sure that we're looking at also is the recruitment program and how that impact the workforce in terms of not only the corrections officer, but the regular staff that comes in daily contact with people that are incarcerated. So what is your overall view? We talked a little bit about this. What are you seeing for the future in terms of recruitment and retention?
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Manning, all of you have heard me talk about staff wellness as my #1 initiative. Recruitment, succession planning, and training is the next one. A couple of things are happening. We are having the baby boomer phenomenon across this country where we have so many people eligible to retire. It's compounded at the Oregon Department of Corrections because 20 and 25 years ago, we built prisons across this state, hired staff, and they stayed with us, which is wonderful. But now they're eligible to retire. So we have over 50% of our staff that's eligible to retire in the next 3 years. So on one hand, it scares me to death, losing all that wisdom and experience. And on the other hand, if there ever was a time where we recruited differently, we posted job descriptions that looked different, like I talked about earlier, and brought the right people into our organization, now's the time for a potential very large reset. So we have a statewide initiative that's actually planning and preparing changes for our recruitment efforts. We're looking at marketing ourselves differently, really trying to change the stigma and stereotype of what it means to be a correctional officer. And in fact, we don't have guards at the Oregon Department of Corrections. We have high-level corrections professionals who come to work every day wanting to change the lives of those in our care. And that's the message we're trying to get out to Oregon to get the right people hired inside our institutions.
Chair Williamson.
I just want to thank you, Director Peters, for your leadership in this work. thank the delegation from Norway, the DOC staff at every level that are here today. My take home from both my visit to Norway and the presentation here and meeting with folks over the last couple of days is that we as senators and representatives represent every corner of this state. We representative communities of all sizes, all political stripe. And it's incumbent upon us to keep our communities safe. It's one of the things we're elected to do. And knowing what I know now, we have to have the courage to lead boldly in this arena as elected officials. We know what we're doing is not keeping our communities as safe as they could be, or giving our citizens a chance at the best life they can have in this state. And so I applaud all of you who are willing to do the work with us to lead boldly towards these reforms and towards change, even when it's hard and even when it's counterintuitive to a lot of the folks who haven't seen what we've seen. So to you and your team, know that you have partners in the Oregon legislature who are ready to take a bold leap with you. And please let us know how we can both be helpful and lead this work.
Great. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. We certainly will.
I would like to also thank everyone who has attended the summit. Clearly, the sponsors that have allowed for this summit to go forward to bring so many people into one venue to hear the messages and the words that we've heard from Norway. And as Chair Williamson said, from our experiences of going to Norway, learning from them and seeing how their system works, as they have stated, they're individuals that are working with their fellow citizens are agents of change. And so the question for each of us, I hope, as we drive back to our communities, is what is it that we as individuals, what is it we as communities can do to help make our neighbors better neighbors? Because after all, we are the world. Thank you very much. Safe travels. And the Senate Judiciary Committee is now adjourned.
The House
Thank you,
Judiciary
co-chairs.
Committee is
Thank you,
now
members.